Hello, everyone, and welcome to AP US History for Winners with your teacher, Mr. Johnson. Last time we talked about the economy and the culture right after World War II, and today we are talking about the early steps in the civil rights movement. So, if you are ready, let's begin. The first thing to know is that there's going to be slow success in the beginning of the civil rights movement. And when we are talking US history and we think about the term civil rights movement, we're thinking about the movements in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to get people of color, especially African Americans, more equal rights under the law. And after World War II, civil rights activists are going to use a variety of strategies to challenge racial segregation. Let's remember what segregation. It is the concept of keeping people of color separate in the United States, and this was commonplace, especially in the South in the late 1800s and early to mid 1900s because of the Supreme Court case. Can you remember it? Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which said that separate but equal was okay under the law. And so we see different facilities for people of color and for white people that were equal in the sense that there were two facilities. So the law let them go. The law said that was okay, but we would never have thought of them as equal in terms of quality. Okay, so civil rights activists are going to challenge this idea of people of color and white people being separate. So there's going to be a number of legal challenges that people are going to bring up, especially through the NAACP, which is a group of lawyers that you are used to litigate and bring lawsuits when there is segregation or things that they feel like are breaking the law. And these are going to be led by this attorney Thurgood Marshall, who's pictured on the top left. He is at this time an attorney, but he will become a Supreme Court justice later. And again, he helps litigate and helps defend the rights of African American citizens inside the United States. Then there's going to be direct action, meaning that people are going to try to get involved on their own. And one famous example of this is Fannie Lou Hamer and what's an event called the Freedom Summer. And this was a summer in Mississippi where she worked, and you can see her pictured on the bottom left. She worked to try to increase the number of African Americans that were registered to vote in Mississippi. If you remember, there was a lot of difficulties for African Americans to get the right to vote. If you think about poll taxes and literacy tests, grandfather clause, all those things are still being used to discriminate against African Americans and keep them from being able to vote. And last, and probably most famous, maybe most notable if you want to bold this one, are the nonviolent protest tactics, especially popularized by Martin Luther King. I would definitely know the name of one of these nonviolent protests. Okay, so the Montgomery bus boycott was a boycott of the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama, where basically the buses were segregated and African Americans and anyone who wanted to support them all decided they were not going to ride the buses. And that's an example of a nonviolent protest tactic. So they're not using violence, but they're making their cause and their message heard. And another example are the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. And those are the most famous ones, but there's sit-ins all over the country. And what sit-ins are basically African Americans weren't allowed to eat at lunch counters, at diners and restaurants, okay, at like the counters. And that was a popular thing to do at the time. And so what they would do is they would sit, African Americans and people who supported them would sit down at these lunch counters and basically refuse to get up. And it caused a huge uproar. I'll show you some pictures in class, but basically it caused a huge uproar of people being very angry at people sitting in these chairs and dumping their food on them and calling them all sorts of negative racial stereotypes and names. So these sit-ins, though, but all they're doing is sitting there. They're not responding violently, right? So the idea of nonviolent protest was people are going to protest against things that are unjust, but they're not going to react violently, even if violence or negative actions are done towards them. But again, main idea here, these are some actions that activists are taking to get more rights, but the success is very slow. So we are also going to get all three branches of the government to help promote racial justice in varying ways throughout the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And we'll go down through each branch and what each branch did as an example. So the executive branch with the president, one of the easiest examples is Harry Truman, president at the end of World War II. His executive order 9981, you don't need to memorize the number of that, But you should know that Harry Truman desegregates the U.S. military. So no longer will they be all black and all white troops. So that's an example of how the executive branch is creating more racial justice. The judicial branch does this in a number of different ways. But the most famous example, and the one you need to memorize, this name of this court case. Just like I told you in 1896 to memorize the Plessy versus Ferguson court case, you need to know the name of this one. This is one of the most important Supreme Court cases in U.S. history. Brown versus Board of Education. And this is in 1954. And this says that segregation is unequal. It overturns Plessy v. Ferguson. So it says that schools are not allowed to be segregated anymore. This is a huge monumental decision that especially all over the country, schools, especially in the South, are going to now need to be integrated. Now, you would think when the Supreme Court, has this decision, that everywhere would say, okay, this is the new ruling. Everyone needs to follow this. But that's not what happened. A lot of the states in the South took their time to enforce the decision and basically did not integrate schools until they absolutely had to, until protests came about. So that's an important concept to know, that the South is going to resist integration even if the government is saying it needs to happen. And the last branch that helps promote racial justice, the last branch of the three, right, is the legislative branch. And this is the branch of government that is passing laws. And some of these are more in the middle of the civil rights movement, but we'll bring them up anyway as examples. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is very important. And it's part of LBJ. You can see picture on the left, President LBJ, who's a president in the 60s. It's part of his plan called the Great Society, which we will talk more about. We'll have a whole lesson about it later. But essentially, this is an extension of FDR's New Deal, but it's supposed to be focused on civil rights for people, okay? And what does the Civil Rights Act do of 1964? It does two important things. It bans discrimination in the workplace. So no longer could you hire or fire people or discriminate against people inside jobs or for hiring practices. And second, it guarantees equal access to public accommodations, meaning anything that is public funded, right? That the government is funding, a park, something that's public, not private, something that's public, everyone has to have equal access to it. And those are two really important factors of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I would make sure I know each one of those. And the second law that I want to bring up is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this is a law that bans discrimination when it comes to voting. For example, it bans literacy tests. And so this is an extension of the work we talked about in the first slide in the Freedom Summer about getting more African Americans registered to vote, but this officially bans literacy tests. Okay, so that is it for our notes on the early steps in the civil rights movement. Let's try to summarize our notes. I know it was short, but there's a lot of important things we need to memorize the names of. So first, let's think about what different ways did civil rights leaders achieve success. Be specific about one leader or one way they found success. Number two, describe one thing that each branch did to help civil rights. We got to memorize the names of these things or what they did. And number three, an important idea and concept, what was the Southern reaction to the early civil rights movement? So that is it. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.